Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Luffy ate Pika Pika no Mi? Before I start, please do support for more awesome content and subscribe my channel and like this video. Go support and follow the Wolvenstrom for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. Let's start this video. Kobe wouldn't say that he's accomplished a lot in his young life. A few years back he had decided to go fishing. He grabbed his fishing rod, tackle and catch box and headed out the door after saying bye to his mother. He'd ambled down to the port hoping to catch the morning fishing vessel. He saw one in particular that looked quite big and from the goofy yet feminine design, may have been owned by a young woman. Boy was he wrong. He was kept a prisoner by Alvida and unwillingly became cabin boy and personal doormat. Made to clean everything that the other men were too good to clean, cook to feed a ridiculous appetite, polish her shoes, and bow and scrape for unwanted approval just before she beat him. His only reward for all these years of forced faithful service was that he got to live another day. Slowly but surely Kobe constructed his escape plan. Collecting spare pieces of wood he'd managed to find, her commander. Alvida didn't notice if a few planks went missing in a fight with a rival, just as long as they were enough to repair her ugly ship. Or care what happened to the chests that they'd take as spoils of victory, just as long as it was only the chests and not the loot inside that went missing, and they always had spare nails lying about for an emergency. He built his raft discreetly in the middle of the woods on their base island where nobody went. It was ugly, shoddy and looked like it couldn't go 10 feet without sinking, but after so many years of being forced to tell a sea hag that she was one of the 3 great beauties of the world, he could only come to one conclusion. 10 minutes of freedom were better than a lifetime on this ship. So he set out under the cover of night, making sure to sneak away from the ship unnoticed and dragged his ship to the other side of the small island, making sure to avoid the patrols who monitor for any approaching ships. He succeeded. He was free. He spent the night drifting with the occasional adjustment to his heading, enjoying the long-awaited freedom to put much more thought into rowing once out of Alvida's range. He headed to the nearest island possible, which fortunately for him had a marine base of all things. Not only did that guarantee his safety from Alvida, but he could fulfill his dream of becoming a great marine. One strong enough to take Alvida in. Then he saw the town. Treading on eggshells, taxed into poverty and little more than slaves to the local marine lieutenant commander Axe-Hand Morgan and his son Helmeppo. These people were forced to pay tribute to the commander lest he had the men under him take them away to be executed for not giving money that they need not give. They bowed every time the commander's spoiled son walked down the street, doing whatever he pleased for fear of his dad's wrath. It was like him on the pirate ship times 1,000. He knew he had to do something. The first option was to release that demon swordsman they'd arrested Rorano's Oro, whose only crime had apparently been saving a little girl from being killed. It was noble, he granted, but that guy just looked too plain scary to release. What's to stop a guy from going berserk and striking him down in a rage? The second option was just as suicidal. If he could get a hold of one of the Marines' den, then he could use it to transmit a signal to another base nearby, telling them about Morgan. In theory the plan was good, however the problem was that even though the Marines clearly didn't like following the blowhard, they liked their necks to remain connected to their shoulders, they were too scared to fight him. Not only that, but the only den strong that could have that sort of signal behind it would logically be in Morgan's office. He'd sneaked past the guards. Not too hard since they looked the other way when he passed them and went into the commander's office on the top floor. The Marines who hadn't seen him gulping audibly at the young boy's bravery. He started talking about Morgan's cruelty when zing. The massive axe blade missed him by a fraction of an inch, carving a deep scar into the floor in front of him and making him jerk back. Morgan in all his giant glory looked down on the weak little pink-haired boy with nothing short of scathing anger, holding his axe hand at the boy's face. "You little bastard. What do you think you were trying to do?" he snarled. Trembling Kobe was still able to get out a few words. I sent a MS message to another B base. The les and Somiona to in an investigate. Morgan's pupils turned into needlepoints. What? His entire operation was based on the fact that he'd cut the town off from the world. The population had gone up considerably from merchants and other sailors he'd forced to stay to keep his superiors from finding out his corruption. If they sent someone he'd be ruined. No matter, he'll just send another call saying a kid broke into his office. Then he'd split this run from skull to groin. Just grab the den and. Where is it? The massive blonde looked around the room for his snail phone. Eventually finding it in the arms of the boy. Me. That. Snail. He growled out. Kobe used his smaller stature to dive through the man's wide stance and run out the door. Followed immediately by the angry lieutenant. It was a rather comical race. A small pink-haired boy carrying a snail being chased by a man 3 times his size who was slashing at him every chance he had. Cutting up walls, furniture and even the odd marine. Finally the chase led them to the execution grounds where Zoro was being held. A whole contingent of marines followed behind their commander. Morgan released a particularly vicious lash at Kobe just as he was passing the bound Zoro. It sailed right over Kobe and went through the rope holding Zoro's left arm. That does it. Men, take aim and kill these two. But yes sir, they took hold of their rifles and pointed them at the swordless swordsman and former cabin boy. You think you can stop me, boy? I'm the greatest marine in the East Blue. Axe hand Morgan. Kobe was shivering in fear, clutching the snail tight enough to choke it. It doesn't matter what you do. They'll still send someone to find out the source of my message. You'll be stripped of rank and sent to impel down. Morgan snorted. Stupid punk. Who will be left to convict me when you're gone? With you two executed and dumped in the ocean, I'll just cover up your tattling and pass it off as my worthless son crying about me punishing him. He smirked when the boy's eyes opened wide in fear. All that with his life on the line was for nothing. Fire. Boom. Everyone was knocked back at the explosive force of the bullet hitting their targets. Which was strange since they didn't think that bullets exploded on impact. Wait a minute. Bullets don't explode. Gasped Morgan. See, they don't explode. Zing. Marines fell to the ground. Holding blistered and burned hands when beams of light lanced out of the smoke cloud and struck the guns. Destroying their guns and hands all at once. Looks like I made it just in time. Said a new voice in the smoke. The kicked up dust soon fell back to the earth. Revealing something that shocked everyone there. VVV Kobe stuttered VVV Vice Admiral Garp. That's what many others thought at the sight. However, several things were off. He was shorter for a start by at least a foot or more. Second, he was nowhere near as bulky as the Marine hero. Not to say he didn't have a build, but this guy looked to be more fit athletic-wise opposed to Garp's heavy stature. The most notable difference however was that this guy was 60 years younger. Not to mention his face actually looked like it couldn't grow hair, while Garp was known to have a short beard that covered his lower face for as long as he's been in the Navy. So yeah, to sum up. Aside from the height, the build, the age and the lack of facial hair, you could totally mistake him for Garp. Yeesh. The Garp look-alike wore a suit like it was casual wear. Black pants, a pale orange short-sleeved shirt that looked slept in with the top 2 buttons undone. A blue tie that was worn like someone who had been at the office all day and loosened it but hadn't taken it off for some reason. On his head was a wide-brimmed black fedora with a pale orange stripe circling it. His feet lacked socks but were protected by slightly worn leather shoes, and of course on his back worn like a cape was the white jacket with Justice written on the back. Signature of Marine officers. 1. Garp. He said confused. Oh, you mean Grandpa. Sorry. I'm Vice Admiral Monkey D. Luffy. At your service. Marineford. Center of the world. Lady justifies every seat of power. It was here that the world's entire navy power was directed and controlled. The day the island headquarters was busier than normal. Literally thousands of Marines scrambled around the island despite there normally only being hundreds on hand. Preparations were being made for an occasion that only happened once in a blue moon. The day they would be promoting new admirals. You had to understand. Admiral was not a position given lightly. The position could be left vacant for months or even years at a time without anyone in the position. Sengoku had left the position vacant for a number of years after his promotion to Fleet Admiral. Looking over the candidates for the prestigious position carefully. Not leaving anything to chance. Then the O'Hara incident happened. 2 vice admirals. Through dedication to absolute justice and raw power had succeeded in one of the greatest military actions ever undertaken since the time of Gold Roger. Thus Vice Admiral Kuzin became Admiral Akiji, the Blue Pheasant, and Vice Admiral Sakazuki became Admiral Akainu, the Red Dog. Of course at the time only one admiral had possessed the power of a devil fruit. Sakazuki had shown loyalty and an unwavering belief in absolute justice like no one had ever seen. This made him the perfect example for all other Marines to follow. However, to truly be fit for the position of Admiral, one needed to be powerful. To be able to take on the most dangerous criminals in the world all by themselves, rather than have lower ranks do it for them. Luckily it was a priority of the world government to squire devil fruits for the sake of boosting the Marines' power. One could refuse them like other admirals had done so in the past, Garp. However, Sakazuki was the kind of Marine who would do anything asked of him without the slightest hint of hesitation. Plus the devil fruit he was to be given was one of exceptional power. Presented to all those years ago if he were to take the position. The fruit was his to eat. Then with one bite. The Red Dog was born. That of course was years ago. Today was an even more historic day. An event which had never happened in the history of the Marines. They would be a 3rd admiral. The transmissions. We have been beaming out to the Sabati Archipelago, Enris Lobby, and every other marine-based town in the world, sir. Even the prisoners in levels 1 to 4 in Impel Down are getting a special viewing, sir. Attendance. Only 6 vice admirals and about 60 officers of lower rank have made it, sir. And that's including the ones that stay in Marineford. The rest cited that criminals might take advantage of such a mass desertion to attack while they were gone, sir. True. The number will suffice. This ceremony is little more than a display of our power, Petty Officer Brisbane. It's my hope that this mere broadcast will make criminals renounce their ways and inspire a new generation to follow the path of absolute justice. Sniff yes, Fleet Admiral. The young man said, holding back passionate tears. Sengoku the Buddha nodded, stopping in front of a large double door and dismissing the petty officer to take care of other duties. Opening them up, he was greeted by a sight infinitely more relieving than that of the vice admirals circled the table, each turning to face their superior with the exception of 2 who were preoccupied at the moment. Sengoku cleared his throat and addressed his fellow admirals. Does everyone understand their roles in today's ceremony? Asked the Supreme Commander. Lumonga was the first to respond. Yes, Fleet Admiral. Our part in the ceremony is both simple yet extremely important. Amr continued, we are to escort Borsellino through the ceremony room until we reach you at the far end before moving to either side of the front of the officers in attendance. All of us play a part in the ceremony for the sole hope that it instills fear of us in the hearts of pirates and inspires the people in the hopes that they join their numbers, said Strawberry. Who's a sweet little baby. You are. Yes, you are. Bababa. Sengoku grimaced, as did most of the other admirals. They would expect such nonsense from Garp, not from the one who was currently babbling like an idiot. Suru, please. Don't coddle my grandson. How is he supposed to grow into a man with you treating him like this? Garp growled angrily while trying to reach around the old woman to take his grandson back. Suru pulled one hand away from the boy she was holding and grabbed one of Garp's outstretched hands. With practice ease, she bent his fingers back, which magically went limp and rolled back like cloth. Rolling his arm up to the elbow, she aimed at his chest, making the hero of the Marines fall back into his chair when his entire midsection took on the consistency of his suit. The old woman turned back to the infant she was holding and resumed her baby talk and tickling, much to the year-old Luffy's delight. Suru. Would you please stop playing with that baby for 2 seconds and focus? This is enormously important. Snapped Sengoku. If the woman heard him, she didn't look at it. Calm down, Sengoku-chan. Chided the old admiral gently. I went through it for Kuzan, Sakazuki, you and many other admirals, since long before you were even an ensign. I know what to do. Sengoku wouldn't back down still. You and Garp will be part of this affair, and it won't do for you to be carrying an infant for the whole world to see. Yamakaji smiled. Yeah, people might think he's yours and Garp's grandson or something, haha ark. The cigar-smoking vice admiral was down by from Garp's now declothed arm. The hero grumbling something about old biddies quiet enough to not be heard. Suru sighed but smiled down at Luffy, who was still giggling away in a manner that would make an adult seem insane. I know. I'll hand him over to a recruit before it starts. But my own great-grandchildren are all grown now, and I haven't held a darling this sweet in over 50 years. She rubbed her nose against Luffy's, making him squeal in delight. No one, not even Sengoku, knew how old this woman was, and none of them had the courage to find out. The gull-hatted man coughed nervously and turned to Garp. And what of you? Bringing the son of him to Marineford? Garp snorted and crossed his arms. I didn't have a choice, all right. My idiot son left as soon as he was conceived, and my daughter-in-law hasn't been fit enough to take care of herself since birth. I'm not gonna leave my grandson to be raised by a village when I can make sure he grows into a marine by bringing him here. The other admirals looked between the hero and the Buddha, clearly not understanding more than half the conversation. Sengoku begrudgingly agreed with Garp's point. The last thing the world needs is another dragon. Ding. Dong. Ding. Dong. Sengoku was pulled from his thoughts, lifting his den and pressing down on the shell to stop the alarm. He looked around the room as the other admirals nodded, each standing up at the same time to leave the room. Suru looked at Sengoku before glancing down at Luffy, then back up to him. Understanding her dilemma, he pulled out another den, mildly annoyed that he had to carry so many slimy insects with him, since they each only did one thing. He put out a call for a recruit to come to the Admiral meeting room immediately. Within seconds, a young lady in a Marine recruit uniform bumbled in, literally as the door flew open, and she fell face first in front of the highest-ranked Marine, before standing up in front of him and saluting. She was young, only about 13 or so, and looked like she would be quite the looker when she finished growing. She had blonde hair done up in a bun and hidden under her cap, and most notably was sporting several bandages and plasters over her arms and face. "Marine recruit Hina reporting for duty, sir," she said enthusiastically. Sengoku stared at the overly eager young recruit for a second before speaking. Yes, he have an assignment that needs taking care of, young lady, and… Yes, sir. The teen cut him off. No doubt you've noticed Hina and have decided to give her a super important mission to benefit the world. The tad on the freaked out side he spoke again. No. I need you to do something very important while the Admiral promotion ceremony is going on. Yes, sir. Hina understands. She is willing to risk life and limb in the name of justice, sir. The bandages adorning 80% of China's body are a testament to her willingness and not because her hyperactivity and clumsiness induced by growth spurt, sir. She said with her ever-present smile. Tsuru clutched the baby just a little bit more. Luffy was enjoying watching the silly girl too much to moan in complaint. Sengoku actually smiled a little at the girl's energy. It reminded him of himself a little when he was a recruit. So eager to prove himself, but maybe a little less annoying. Nothing no serious. Tsuru, if you would. The elderly officer shuffled over to the girl and showed her Luffy, who was captivated by the new face, just as the girl was captivated by the baby. I need you to keep an eye on Luffy here until the ceremony is over. Can you do that? Now it was the blonde's turn to look oddly at someone. Hina-kan. She said uncertainly. But China doesn't understand why Vice Admiral Tsuru has a baby in the first place. Or why she was just called here to babysit. Is it because Hina is a girl? Because if it is, then it's Garp's grandson, said the gull-hatted man, hoping to leave quickly and knowing just the right buttons to push to get the expected reaction. True to prediction, the girl's devolving anger quickly became awe. The grandson of the legendary hero of the Marines, she said in barely a whisper. Taking the tyke from Tsuru's unwilling arms and holding him with reverence is more than Hina's duty. It is her honor to take care of him for the time being. Sengoku nodded and nudged Tsuru's shoulder, taking the ancient woman's attention away from Luffy, who seemed to be enjoying his new friend's presence. The woman sighed but nodded. The fleet admiral left the room, followed shortly by Tsuru, who gave the two one last look before leaving. It's okay, Vice Admiral Tsuru. You can trust Hina. Tsuru looked at the girl for an instant more before leaving, closing the door behind her. Now to carry out her mission. If she remembered right, babies like milk, they had to have left a bag around here somewhere. Sit tight for a second, grandson of the hero, Hina needs to find you food. She placed the baby on the spacious table, hoping to find a baby bag holding all his essentials. She looked around the room, around the table and even under it. Only to find nothing. Boy, for such a legendary man, he doesn't even know the basics of infant care. Hina whispered as though saying something bad about Garp was the worst thing she could do. Well, Luffy, we'll have to go to the Kichi egg. The baby was gone. It was no longer in the space in which she had placed him. The place where he'd been and the place he was were no longer the same location. She'd heard people say just taken my eyes of etc. for a second, but this was ridiculous. WWAHH. Not Luffy, by the way. Hina's going to the brig for this. She searched the entire room, throwing the priceless antiquated table over and breaking it when it came back down, toppling and smashing anything she could see to find the precious bundle. Never did she notice the small opening in the glass doors that led out to a spacious balcony. Luffy was hungry. He'd found the weird talking girl to be funny, and all but food was his main concern at the moment, and like his family, he didn't like to wait for his food. Seeing as she didn't have any food, he decided to venture out and find his own. The tiny figure in the red romper suit crawled out onto the spacious balcony overlooking a great deal of Marine headquarters. One he could look at through the gap between the marble columns of the guardrail. The pretty view was not edible, however. Therefore not worth his interest. That delightful smell was. He quickly crawled towards the direction the smell was coming from. If anyone were watching him at the time, they would swear they heard a music box sort of tune play in the background. They'd be paralyzed by the sheer adorableness of the sight. He crawled up to a door, the smell was coming from through it, and for the life of him, he didn't know how to get through. He was about to cry, which would have alerted someone to his presence, had the door not flung itself open a moment before he could. A Marine came running out the door, his face panicked and covered in sweat. If he knew Luffy was there, he didn't show it. Believing the officers to still be there, he headed frantically towards the room the infant had just left and leaving him a door to crawl through. He continued to make his way down the hall. Other Marines were too preoccupied to notice a brightly dressed infant crawling slowly down the middle of the stark white halls and babbling incoherently. Finally he came to a spacious double door where the smell was emanating from. The Marine base was so large that every few floors had its own kitchen. He sat back on his rear and waited for another funny person to let him in. Not expecting someone to rush up behind him with a dinner cart, the low bottom shelf scooping him up rather than running him over. "Here you are, Chef Bergignan," a lowly kitchen assistant said with his head lowered towards the 7-foot man in the tall white hat. "Excellent," he said in a deep French accent. Turning to face the rest of the kitchen staff, he addressed them loud and clear. "Everyone, The item has arrived. The silence was deafening. Of course there was silence before he spoke to them. Not a single one was charged with cooking today, as the entire staff was dedicated to this single task. My loyal Nakama. Today we embark on what may perhaps be the defining moment of my, not all of our careers. With this single seemingly impossible task we shall become known worldwide and become the stuff of culinary legends. His assistant started growing misty-eyed. One snorted loudly. These legends will be determined by how much heart and soul we pour into this task. If we fail we will become dogs. Unworthy to cook for even the slaves of the noble. The collective shudder. But should we succeed? Ho ho my friends, we shall eclipse the legendary all blue with our glory. For today we shall. He grabs the lid of the disc on the cart and pulls it off. Make a devil fruit taste good. The collective gasped this time. One man fainted. It can't be done, chef. One man said in despair. I should know. Mine tasted like burnt rotten eggs and curdled milk. Said another with cat ears pointing out of his little hat. As the hysteria reached its peak, Brigignan slammed his palms down on the nearby table, effectively silencing them again. Nothing is impossible. We shall turn this disgusting fruit into a meal fit for the Gorosei or die trying. He said with much fire in his voice. But what about the taste? Just because Burks tasted like eggs and milk doesn't mean this will. Admiral Akenu said it was like swallowed congealed hot sauce. And as for Akiji he compared it to a brain freeze from drinking ice-cold squid ink. And we can't exactly taste it without it losing its power. Pointed out another chef. Brigignan wagged his finger and twirled his stereotypical pointy mustache. We won't have to be my young friend. Think carefully. A hot taste for a fruit that looked like a pepper. A cold taste for one that resembled a winter vegetable. Why these tastes seem to be nothing more than extremes of the normal. So this fruit, he said, pointing to the swirl-covered lemon-shaped fruit. It took the cook in question only a few seconds to come up with an answer. We need something to cover a horribly sour taste. Exactly. As the men and women rushed about the kitchen to prepare this one dish, Luffy was listening to all the sounds on the other side of the cloth separating him from a line of adult vision. Not at all scared by the loud noises as a normal baby should be, as he had garbed for a grandfather. Instead he was following the other most basic instinct besides fear. That being hunger. He went to move the cloth out of the way when the cart was jostled again, sending him onto his back. The kitchen staff were reduced to little more than a blur of motion, each taking their turn with the main ingredient, and at soar level speeds, had added their own touch to the nasty fruit. Adding spices, segmenting it, mashing segments in with other fruit, other pieces were covered in so much rich sauce that the spoons that stirred it dissolved. The cart whirled about the room to each cook, ensuring that they would get equal time with it without all reaching for it at once. In the span of 5 minutes the cart, which had formerly held but a single lemon-shaped fruit, now held 6 nouveau dishes. Each looking like they wouldn't feed a sparrow and containing but one bite of fruit. However, as long as no piece was actually eaten, then a devil fruit could be diced as thin as potato chips and still have all its power waiting to be released. Brigignan looked over each meal with a critical eye. It would be meaningless to send 6 dishes to the ceremony area. When one bite was all that was needed, no, he needed to pick the one meal that wouldn't leave the new Admiral retching in front of the entire world and showing even a sliver of weakness. He judged them by appearance, ingredient save for the main one, and most importantly smell. Before deciding on one that had the fruit placed center on a plate surrounded by concentric rings of thick mango, lychee and raspberry sauces, with fine white and almost black chocolate powder sprinkled over it. I feel like I'm turning diabetic from looking at this. This one, he declared, causing everyone to save for one very happy cook to go kneel in a corner. Brigignan stomped over to the cook, towering over him enough that the young man was eye level with his 8-pack. What you do today will change the world of fine dining forever. You will be a hero. He bellowed loudly. Tears of joy appeared in the cook's eyes. And if you fail you'll be sent to the lowest level of impel down for making the Marines look foolish after all my boasting. Brigignan said casually. Tears of a different kind appeared in the cook's eyes. Going numb and only vaguely being aware of the massive hands pushing him in front of the cart and the other guy away from it. Oh. Your destiny awaits. The head chef with tears in his eyes, waving the young man off to glory and perhaps certain doom. Beneath the cart a certain baby was starting to feel the effects of being pushed around at lightning speed. He was fortunate that his little stomach was empty right now. Something which he hoped soon to rectify with the fruity smelling thing above him. The young cook ran down the hallways as fast as he could, the tray rattling a little with every step. Needless to say he was a little nervous about the whole affair. Of course Murphy's Law states that when someone is in a rush to get anywhere. Crash. The tray went flying into the air to land several feet ahead of the cart. Fortunately the meal inside was held in place by the exceptionally thick fruit sauce, so not a drop was moved out of place. Luffy was also sent away from the cart, only instead of flying through the air to land with a loud clatter, he slid out and went sailing across the floor on his rump, thanks to his romper suit, his expression one of quiet confusion, until he found himself at a stop in front of the source of the fruity smell, then his lips widened into a happy grin. He lifted the silver top over the meal rather clumsily before clambering under it, dropping the platter after he was completely under it. The young cook rubbed his head and got up. Apologizing profusely to the marine he had ran into before picking up the platter and putting it back on the cart. Urgency overriding any thought which may have left him wondering why the food suddenly became so heavy. The ceremony hall of Marineford was not often used. It was barely even entered. Janitors and other cleaning staff could still be seen dotted about amongst the crowds of Marines, scrubbing those last few inches of floor or polishing the marble enough to be seen in. The hall wasn't that big either. Oh sure, it was impressive as hell, but it was no bigger than a high school assembly hall. Intricate carvings in the walls depicting the Marines' near millennia of bringing peace and justice to the world. White marble columns lining a staircase that lead up to a platform with a pedestal on it. The pedestal had a marble dress dummy on it adorned with a jacket only a strict few are ever permitted to wear. The near is identical, but not quite the same as the lower-ranked Marine Admiral overcoat, symbolizing one of the three Navy powers' status. At the bottom of the staircase, everyone from Vice Admiral to Lieutenant Major was filing in. Lining up on either side of the room in order of rank as a brilliant red carpet was rolled down the middle. "Damn, this is annoying," moaned Garp while standing in the hall waiting for the progression with Borsellino. "I could be training some new recruits right now. Instead I gotta be part of this damn ceremony for that lazy ass." Sura rolled her eyes. "Well, if you hadn't rejected it the numerous times they asked then you wouldn't have to go through this now, would you?" "Damn old bat," Garp mumbled under his breath. To which Tsura responded with a clip around the ear. Some after the Marines finished entering the room a few news crews soon followed, carrying what looked like animal cages with them. They scattered to the room's corners where they opened the cages and lifted out large snails. They stuck the bugs to the sides of the walls and pointed to the room's ceiling as if the creatures would understand. The snails slithered up the wall at a speed betraying their species and stopped in the positions they were instructed to, gazing out into the room while their carriers fiddled with some television sets until a picture came through, giving the signal to the signal that they were up and running. The hall suddenly became deathly quiet. The large double doors opened up and two ensigns entered, flanking a man who looked like he just got up, looked at his clock, and decided to go back to sleep until someone dragged him out of it by his heel. He wore a pale yellow suit with the shirt untucked and the suit jacket only partially buttoned. He yawned loudly and scratched at the 3 days of stubble on his face, then rubbed his eyes under his sunglasses. Several of the admirals were understandably upset that the guy who looked like he made a living selling things out of a cart in a back alley could possibly be considered their superior. They just bit into their tongues and looked forward. The progression up the carpet was slow, and not just because Borsellino dragged his feet. The den captures every movement. At the top of the stairs stood Akainu, Aokiji and Sengoku, with Sengoku standing just off the center of the upper platform. Sengoku was trying very hard not to suddenly yell out for the soon-to-be full admiral to hurry up. Akainu was not so tactful and groaned loudly and glared at the lazy man. When he finally got to the stairs, the vice admirals separated to either side of the room, leaving the soon-to-be Kizaru to trudge up the stairs. The camera snails' entire attention were locked onto the lethargic man as part of the ceremony. Even if they'd heard it, they couldn't take their eyes off him to see a young girl enter just before the doors were closed and quickly but silently make her way up past the officers. Garp had his entire attention focused on what was in front of him, but thanks to years of training was able to reflexively reach out and put a hand over the girl behind his mouth. He turned his head just enough to address her without looking like he wasn't watching the proceedings. "What is it?" he said in a quiet manner as someone like him could manage. She was unsure how to put this. "Garp, sir. Hina, I mean me was tasked with looking after your grandson and you lost him." His voice was more tired than angry. Hina let out a sound so pitiful it made a puppy's whine sound like Moria's laugh. The hero took a deep breath. Knowing he was going to regret this immensely, he broke the file and pulled the young girl to the side of the room, not even looking back at Sengoku, who was giving him a death glare behind his glasses while using the room's lighting to hide it in reflection. As soon as the immense door clicked behind him, Garp lifted his hand away from Hina's mouth, only to clamp it back on an instant later when the girl was ready to let out the mother of all mournful wails. "I'm going to skin him and use his leathery hide to make a sweet." For all appearances you never would guess that was what Sengoku the Buddha was thinking right now. His expression was that of pride and trust, a look that would have anyone believe anything he said no matter what that may be. When in fact he was putting 90% of his mind towards thoughts of killing his longtime friend in the worst possible ways. Of course, with the world quite literally watching his every action, he couldn't act on anything right now. So with a resolve like his epitaph implied, he continued with the proceedings. Borsellino made his way around the table to stand next to his superior officer, still as relaxed and affluent as ever. Behind him was the coat and in front of him a table where his powers would soon be. The gull-hatted man coughed a little to clear his throat, then spoke in as loud and dignified a voice as he could manage. Justice. A single word, yet this single word carries the weight of the entire world. And as Marines, it is our never-ending duty to lend ourselves to shoulder to this mighty burden. The door opens up at the top of the stairs. The young cook walks in, his hands at either side of the platter. He slowly makes his way down, all the while trying not to look like the dish edge was cutting into his skin. And at times one emerges who takes it upon themselves to willingly take more of this burden than others. Now one man of such character has been brought forth. But the thud, the platter was placed on the table, the cook rushing away from the scene, but staying close enough to witness the fruits of his labor. Sengoku turned to Borsellino. Vice Admiral Borsellino. For more than 2 decades you have been a Marine, and in those 20+ years you have succeeded in capturing no less than 10,000 criminals, ended more than 100 pirate crews single-handedly, and aided in the capture of more than 30,000 criminals. Your actions were rewarded again and again until you achieved your current rank. No problem. The banana-striped man said, waving his commanding officer's words off. Aokiji just rolled his eyes a little, while Akainu was noticeably smoldering. Now, in what has never been done in the history of the Marines, we welcome you as the 3rd Admiral. That signaled the 2 current admirals' parts in this little drama. They moved in sync, taking the coat from the dummy to move behind Borsellino. Aokiji pulled the old one from his back, where it was then taken away by a nearby ensign who scuttled off with it. But the adornment of this coat, you will no longer be Vice Admiral Borsellino. Taking this upon your back will signify your utter dedication to justice. You will no longer be regarded as a man, but as a power unto itself whose sole purpose is eliminating evil. Your identity and your very name shall be stripped from you, never to be uttered by another soul again. Do you accept it? The Vice Admiral shrugged at Suri. Fortunately, the man was wearing a hat that hid his twitching brow. He nodded towards the other admirals who draped the jacket over his shoulders, completing his overblown promotion. Then farewell Vice Admiral Borsellino. And let the world welcome Admiral Kizaru. He swept his arm out towards the assembled officers, cueing them to start cheering their brains out. Now he started again, causing the Marines to quiet down again. What is a powerful man without a powerful ability? He pointed to the platter underneath the silver cover as a source of power like no other. The Logia devil fruit. He waited a second for that to sink in, then continued, we scoured the world in search of a fruit that would give this man with power worthy of his station. Upon eating this accursed fruit, he will be gifted with strength enough to shape the very face of the world. He grabbed the handle. Kizaru. Eat this and gain the power to uphold justice. With a small flourish he pulled the lid away. Are you sick? The vein bulged under Sengoku's gull hat. That's it. Why are you so difficult? The room went from regular silence to creepy silence, the kind that, unlike regular silence, no one wanted broken. In place of what should be an attempt at turning something that tastes like death into a delicacy was something that could only be considered the same if you were that brat prince on Drum Island. A baby that looked remarkably like a certain pain in the Fleet Admiral's backside looked up at him, smiling back at the man that sweet and innocent way babies do, covered from head to toe in sugary sauce, most of which was around his mouth. Thud. The cook hit the floor. Suru ran up the stairs and swept the little boy up. Luffy-chan, how did you get under there? He said to the boy while trying to wipe away the sauce with a handkerchief. Everyone else was left looking at a plate licked clean. Sengoku and the rest stared at the plate for what felt like forever before the man put the lid down, took off his glasses, wiped them to remove imaginary dist, and put them back on. He turned about, looked straight at Aden and took a deep breath. Garp and Hina searched the room meticulously, along with several other men and women they had found along the way. Branching out and going every which way over the base to find his grandson. Hina was in tears. This is a disaster. Hina's first hick mission from the Fleet Admiral and she messed it up. She lost Garp, the hero's grandson. Hina's a lousy Marine. Garp patted the girl back gently. From his perspective, from hers it was like being hit by a club repeatedly, and smiled, there girl. We all make mistakes. She looked up at the idol of anyone who's ever worn white for the past 30 years. Boo-boo. Listen. All of my family's like this. Heck, one time when Luffy's father was 2 he got lost and I found him on the next island a week later, no worse for wear. Knowing my genes, he'll turn up in the one place we never would have thought. The entire room shook as a massive wave of Ishoku haki washed over Marineford, bringing hundreds of men to their knees. Garp shivered violently, but still managed to catch the girl he had been talking to and keep her conscious. What was that? Hina stammered. Her tears were gone in the face of pure fear. Garp groaned. What else? Irony and an ass kicking. I'm bored. It had always bugged Zoro. It seemed to be some sort of unwritten law of the world that power went hand in hand with insanity. The weaker, normal people tended to stay fairly uninteresting for the most part, except of course for the rare few. Strong people by contrast almost all had some glaring personality flaw that made it all but impossible to take them seriously. Unless of course that flaw was that they were sadistic psychos who considered other people as disposable as one of those cheap throwaway cameras you get, so you don't have to worry if it's stolen, at which time you should take them very seriously. The monkey line in particular was a prime example of this theory. Both Garp and Luffy were revered for their strength and were also known to be bad sh% insane and annoying as hell. Both of them having endless appetites, overabundant energy and an impossibly small attention span, which required them to be almost constantly stimulated. This made boat trips hell to be on if either was on your ship. Zoro learned that the hard way. He closed his eyes as tightly as he could, trying to focus on his swinging and ignoring the marine bouncing around like a luminous super ball. "I'm bored." Zoro groaned, turning to a nearby marine on the ship who was faring much better. "Is he always like this?" The marine nodded sagely, pulling out 2 small orange plugs from his pocket and handing it to the swordsman who quickly snatched them up. Sighing in relief at the chattering died down. Luffy meanwhile was quite obviously as jumpy as his namesake. He hated traveling by boat. For one who could travel at the speed of light, anything that took even the smallest period to wait for wasn't worth his time of day. He'd been in the East Blue on big government type business that he's not really been paying attention to when he heard an incoming distress call from the last island. If it had been anyone else it would have taken a few hours to reach it and by then the emergency may be over, but for him it took only a handful of seconds, plus the few minutes for that base commander screaming at him where exactly this other base was. Navigating is the navigator's job, not his. He hit stuff. Like Krieg and his son who were currently behind bars below deck. Flashback. Die. Boom. Die. Boom. Die obviously. Boom boom boomity boom. Luffy stood perfectly still with his arms crossed. Bored was a fan of Helsing watching Twilight as Morgan's determination to bisect him in every which way. Which had grown tedious after 5 minutes. Each strike which could kill a giant if aimed right passed harmlessly through the young officer's energy-based form. The other marines, this idiot's son as well as the 2 behind him, had summed up the outcomes exactly 4 minutes and 53 seconds ago. With only one not looking happy. He yawned loudly despite Morgan cutting into his neck hard enough to go through a normal person effortlessly. "Are you done?" he asked lazily. Boom. Apparently he wasn't. Luffy on the other hand. Die. Flash bullet. Morgan's axe came down just as Luffy casually raised his finger toward the axe. It glowed slightly before a ball of light the size of a marble blasted forth and struck the blade. Bang. A steel axe, which was Morgan's namesake, exploded into 100 tiny shards, none of which hit anyone except their former owner who was peppered with them. Saved only because he was so enormously muscular. The blast sent the man flying past his men and crashing into the stone walls, leaving a cracked outline that held form for only a moment before crumbling on top of him. Silence hung heavy in the execution yard for a moment. Nameless soldiers blinking slowly as though they were staring at the dawn sun after months of dark. They gazed between Luffy and the pile of rubble covering their commanding officer. "You eat Lieutenant Morgan." One breathed out. His gun almost slipped from his fingers before catching it. Luffy didn't smile. "Yeah right. Guy didn't even put up a good fight." The facts filtered into their brains, forcing the way through the years of abuse and terror their superior had inflicted upon them, which made them believe it impossible. Sending fireworks in their minds. "It's over, it's over, it's over, it's over, it's finally over." Is it over? Morgan is finished. Every man threw their loaded guns to the ground, not caring if they were discharged. Cheers rose up loud enough to echo over the entire village, the entire island. Fists pumped, men hugged and laughed and cried. Not one tear on their faces shed out of sorrow. Luffy grinned and fixed his hat. He turned to the 2 behind him, Zoro both awed and slightly on edge, with the boy still being a marine and all. He tugged on the brim of his hat and faced Kobe. "So, which one of you made the call?" After properly containing the now unarmed Morgan and taking care of his bowling brat, Luffy had been debriefed by the now acting base commander Ripper. It would be needless to say that Morgan would be spending quite a bit of time in the Great Helmeppo, who although could not be charged with abuse of power as he wasn't an officer was still sharing in his father's punishment. The townsfolk wanted turns with a whimpering heap which Luffy was willing to let them have. It was Kobe who had the idea of having the boy make up for his father's misdeeds, so starting that day Helmet Head Helmeppo was officially made part of the Marines as a chore boy. Followed by Zoro and Kobe. Flashback numero dos. "What? Do you mean it?" Luffy smiled at the 2 in front of him as he sat on the acting base commander's desk much to the man's annoyance, dangling his legs and kicking the wood like a child. He'd just told the two of their enlistment into the forces of justice. Kobe was understandably on cloud 9, and Zoro was understandably pissed. The swordsman unsheathed Wado and pointed it right at the boy, temporarily forgetting Morgan's own lack of success. "Who do you think you are?" The Vice Admiral seemed not to notice the anger, since his answer seemed to be for Kobe. "Sure do. I figure anyone who has the guts to stand up to a creep like Morgan needs to be a Marine." The rest of what Luffy said was drowned out by the angelic song filling his ears. He was finally starting on his dream of being a Marine Admiral. If he'd been able to hear anything but divine music at the moment, the next few words from Luffy's mouth, such as training and grandpa, then he'd be hearing something entirely different altogether. Zoro didn't want to hear it. He lowered his friend's sword and headed for the door. "Well, you can forget it. I have a goal to accomplish. Working for the government will only hamper me." Luffy childishly pouted but nodded fine. The moss-haired man nodded and opened the door, only to be greeted by two armed Marines pointing rifles between his eyes and his heart. "What the?" "Take him away, men." Ripper ordered the two, who grabbed Zoro's wrists and were immediately thrown into opposite walls with incredible force. "What is this?" Luffy held up his hands with 3 fingers extended, while Ripper spoke, "Assaulting civilians, 2 counts of assaulting Marines and now resisting arrest." Luffy whistled. "We've got enough to put you away for at least a few years." Zoro sputtered when he felt another barrel pressed against the back of his head. Luffy slid off the table past a still dreaming pink-haired boy. Olmepo before his drafting was technically a civilian. By slicing up his pet, that counts as assault when they tried to arrest you the first time you attacked a few good men before coming back to the base. "And resisting arrest?" Zoro said bitterly. "The Vice Admiral grinned just now when you threw those 2 off." He ignored the glare and continued, "So here's the deal. You join the Marines and your slate is wiped clean. Or we fit you with black and white pajamas. So what's your answer?" Flashback end. It wasn't as bad as supposed. They still let him keep his swords, and he was given a rank that didn't have him racing around with a mop like the other 2 new Marines. In fact, Luffy seemed quite insistent that he have a rank that fitted with his already existing fame. From bounty hunter to junior lieutenant in one day was a hell of an advance. He'd also made it quite clear that he still had every intention of being the greatest swordsman in the world. Luffy laughed like he did at almost everything, telling the user that having the #1 swordsman as a Marine instead of a former pirate would be great for everyone. He then said that he could introduce him to one day. If he ever bothered to show up for a meeting, that is. Say what you want about how smart he is, but Monkey D. Luffy had an almost instinctive ability to say just what needed to be said to get the effect he desired. Meanwhile, in another little town in the East Blue, one without the fortune of a Marine base, a lone figure stalked the back alleys, drawing closer and closer towards a building filled with singing and other merriment. The map was in there. No doubt about it. More. "But Captain, you've already eaten through half the ship's pantry." Bang. "More." "Aye, Captain." Example 2. "Is that all you have, sir? You've barely touched your food." "It's alright. Justice will keep me sustained, give the rest to the men. They need it more than I." Sniff. "Yes, sir." Point 3. The higher the odds are against you, the more likely you are to win. "What's that, Tiny? You think a runt like you can take on a whole 20 giants like us? Ha 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 ha. You're joking." "I assure you I never joke. Now prepare yourself." He drew his weapon. The giant grinned. "Suit yourself. Die human." The massive being's club swung down. "My name is Mihik." Then we come to our relevant point number 4. The more ridiculous and sadistic the training, the bigger the payoff. Case in point is the newly minted Junior Lieutenant Rorano Zoro, who is currently swinging a practice sword on deck while others keep a clear distance away from him. No sense getting hit by accident. Especially when the sword has a few tons worth of weight loaded onto it and it's being moved about like it weighs as much as cotton candy. "Lieutenant." To attention. An official sounding voice bellowed behind him. It went unheeded, of course, since it hadn't been that long since he'd actually became a Marine and expected the voice to be yelling at someone else. It wasn't until a sword swiped through the air where he had been that Zoro began to suspect that they were talking to him. "I said attention, seaman," the man growled before turning to face you and glared. "Don't even snicker," he threatened, turning back to Zoro. "When I pay attention to Rorano, I mean it," he said evenly, the anger bleeding from him. The swordsman debated whether he should answer with his mouth or his steel. He wisely chose the latter. "Sorry. I'm still not used to Marine life." The officer stared through him. He drew up to Zoro, so his face was inches from the new Marine's good. "Don't." He pulled back, glancing from side to side to make sure that they were still reasonably alone. "Let's get one thing clear. You scum-sucking lowlife. You aren't a Marine. You're a criminal, plain and simple." The hand brushing Wado's sheath itches like crazy. "Really? That's not what the Vice Admiral said." The man scoffed. "That idiot. Please, the only power that boy has is solely from his devil fruit. The truth is that he has no more say outside of the public eye than the chore boys he brought aboard. Seeing Zoro's confused expression, he continued. Luffy is a legacy. His grandfather is the greatest hero of the past 100 years. His promotion to Vice Admiral is nothing more than a ploy to impress the public. So he's not really so high ranked. It wasn't a question. Well, officially he is. But he doesn't have all of the privileges an officer has. His every decision is reviewed by those who earned their position on merit. He didn't have the authority to exonerate any of you of your charges in the first place. But you do. He correctly guessed. The man grinned indeed. I am Vice Admiral Momonga. The real man who gets to decide if the three of you get to continue enjoying the world above the sea. Anyone worth their salt knew exactly what the Mohawk Mullet Man was implying. I'll keep that in mind, Zoro said, returning to his swinging. Momonga stared at the back of the mossy head for a few more moments. Certain his little threat had gotten through. Elsewhere, an older gentleman stalked through the silent streets. Nothing but a faint breath and a clinking of metal that could be mistaken for dropping coins to give him away. We don't need a marine base here, I said. This island is too quiet for criminals to come, I said. Boodle, you're as senile as they come. His beliefs weren't unfounded, mind you. Pirates really never came here in the years the town had prospered. It was the most isolated speck of dirt in the East Blue, too much hassle to sail between islands for any of the hot-blooded fame hoarders pirates were these days. Unfortunately, Buggy the Clown was a crook before the Golden Age started. He didn't care for notoriety or glory. He just wanted money and was willing to take the low and long road to get it. Leaving the terrors of the Demon Sea, he settled in the weakest quarter of the world, where if he was careful he could pillage and plunder in relative peace for the rest of his life. The town, like Boodle's, was perfect for him. The people had fled at the first sight of the pirate flag. Not even the local police force was enough to deal with the likes of the clown and his men. They did manage to help get everyone to the shelters on the outskirts, which they would stay at until Buggy left. That was a week ago. Finally, Boodle could not stand it anymore and set out on his own. No one would miss one old man even if he was the mayor. He knew he couldn't fight them mano a mano. Fortunately, he didn't have to. He snuck into his house, which had the doors barely hanging to the hinges. They must have thought the mayor would have treasure or some such nonsense. Well, it was true to a sense. He did have something that was technically valuable in here. He creeped his way down to the basement, past the also broken door. He knew his home well enough to know where not to step on the normally creaky floorboards, so he could descend without the smallest groan from the wood. He moved past his preserves, priceless heirlooms and other irreplaceable junk that hadn't been deemed valuable enough to steal, looking out with a keen eye until he spotted the object he was looking for. He smiled and reached out to pick up the den. The animal, munching slowly on something in the corner of its mouth, which he guessed to be some pickled beets, judging from the pungent smell of vinegar and red stains around its thick white Fu Manchu. It was hidden away in a corner where none could find it unless they knew it was there. The mayor had never been happier for someone to question him than the man who left this with him all those years ago. He lifted the receiver off the old snail's shell and did what he had to do. Vice Admiral Momonga. Vice Admiral Luffy. We have an emergency. A marine burst through the doors leading from below deck, running over to the older of the two officers, while the younger listened in from up on the nearby mast. What is it? The man said, cruelty. This had better be important. We just received an SOS, sir. A nearby island has been taken over by pirates, sir. The Vice Admiral reacted swiftly. He turned on his heel and called out to the rest of his men with a tone just under a shout. Men, make the preparations. If you were expecting a huge explosion of movement, then I'm sorry to disappoint you. One or two men ran below deck, while the rest continued with whatever they'd been doing at the time, some even slowed to a more leisurely pace. This confused the hell out of Zoro. Of course, Luffy was as predictable as ever. As soon as his fellow Vice Admiral gave the order, the grinning boy jumped down from the high-up mast and landed without as much as a thud in front of him. Are you ready, Luffy? Momonga asked. He nodded energetically, just pointing the way. Ensign. The lower-ranked marine produced a map from seemingly nowhere and showed it to his superiors while pointing to one small dot on it. The distress message originated 27 miles south by southwest of this location. That way. Momonga pointed out across the sea. Oh. Got it. Grinned the boy before he started to dissolve into light, vanishing before Zoro's astonished eyes. What's? Momonga brushed past him rudely, shouting to the upper deck to take them in the direction he told Luffy. What's happening in Raranoa is this crew, this division's sole purpose? Nami ran down Main Street. 5 bloodthirsty maniacs chasing after her with swords flashing in front of them. She was far more fleet-footed than the circus rejects and, from what she could see, several years younger. However, just because they hadn't realized they could just shoot her instead of chase her didn't mean that they eventually would. Hey, wait. I just remembered we have guns. Yeah. She can't outrun bullets. Hey. They weren't allowed to figure that out so soon. The men in makeup pulled out their flintlocks while running after the girl who was gradually putting distance between them. The guns making the unwelcome clicking sound that everyone who's ever had one pointed at them hates. They would have shot if a blinding light like a second sun hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. Let me see if I can understand this. Your job is to do nothing. Zoro exclaimed. The crew had lost considerable vigor. Some were actually lazing about in clear view of their superior officer without the slightest hint of worry. The mullet mohawk man scoffed. Your ability to ignore people is just astounding, Rarana. I didn't say that. Everything has been set up already, so the men use this short amount of time to relax. You see, our duty is not to do nothing, we simply do not engage in combat. That task is solely the responsibility of Garp's grandson. Nami and the Buggy pirates watched in awe as the blinding light formed into a boy who dressed like a marine. It's Monkey D. Luffy. Run. The pirates scrambled for their lives. Just as the Vice Admiral watched after them. A glowing finger pointed in their direction. Flash cannon. This whole division was built up around Monkey's overwhelming ability. Assigning any more men who specialize in combat would have been nothing but a waste of resources. So what do you do? Zoro asked snarkily. Lamanga counted to 10 before answering. It is our duty to A. Send the buffoon who lacks the ability to tell north from south in the direction he needs to go. B. Detain all surviving criminals in the numerous prison cells below. And C. Clean up his mess. Clean up his mess? So you expect him to be subtle? Kaboom. Nami brought her arms up to shield her eyes from the blinding flash of light and the massive explosion that reduced the men to ash, along with a few houses. While honestly freaked at the power the Marine displayed, she was eternally relieved that he had saved her. Thanks. She muttered out, catching his attention. Ops. Missed one. He's like a charging bull. Unbelievably powerful and unbelievably destructive. His abilities make him quiet to action and quick to conclusion. Rarely thinks before he does something. Nami's eyes widened in horror at the glowing finger pointing at her. Energy pooling at the tip. Our duty as the ones who watch after him is to keep his actions under wraps. He paused. It would not look good for the world to know that the Marines are harboring something 1,000 times more destructive than any pirate after all. That was close. You alright, lady? She stood, frozen like a statue, staring out past the young Vice Admiral. Her eyes felt like raisins, and her pupils were like needle points. Her left cheek was red and almost sunburned from the sheer heat of the energy beam that had just lanced mere centimeters past her head. Behind her was a pile of shattered and scorched concrete where another pirate had been hoping to sneak up while her back was turned. Lady? You there? He snapped his fingers in front of her face. Failing to get a response, he brought his hands together for a loud clap. This time making her snap out her trance and fall back onto her rear in surprise. Luffy smiled, grateful he hadn't scared someone to death again. That's a relief. Aggghh. She screamed. Scampering away on all fours until she hit a house. Why are you? Aggghh. Will you stop? Aggghh. Zing. The finger appeared over her lips at the speed of light. Both silencing her and exhibiting her unmatched bladder control. You gonna stop screaming? He asked demanded. She nodded as rapidly as she could while having a finger she'd just seen used to atomize 4 pirates almost up her nose. Good. He slowly took the finger away and took a few steps back, casually glancing over the town. Man, this place is a ghost town. You are the only one left. Hello. He once more snapped his fingers in her face a few times before her pupils refocused. No. No. I'm just a visitor here. I came here looking for a few things just to find everyone run out of town by Buggy the clown. She'd better establish her story now, just in case he decides he really does have to kill her. Feeling immensely relieved when he seemed to accept her answer. Standing up to his full unimpressive height, he walked away. I'd leave if I were you. Don't want you caught in the crossfire. Before she could even respond, his body dissolved into sparkling fairy dust and vanished into thin air. Expelling a breath she didn't know she'd been holding in, she reached into her pocket and pulled out what she had been willing to risk life and quite possibly limb for. Good, it didn't tear during the run. Now I just have to decide if getting it was the hard part or not. An awesome death. Captain do. BBB. The face-painted pirate was vaporized instantly in the wake of the heat and power of Buggy, the clown's custom-made cannonballs. You have to do that every time, Captain. We've got barely any left as it is. His second mate commented boredly. Somehow able to speak clearly past the glass and frothy liquid and while juggling knives with as much effort as blinking or passing gauze for the polite term. Those bastards deserved it for making me look stupid. So what if we lose a few men? He managed to yell through a massive wall of his own bull and tea. Actually, I meant the buggy balls. We only have 2 left. Kabaji pointed out. Deflating the giant clown head back to its smaller yet no less bizarre form. The clown crossed his arms and sank into his throne. Mumbling about Kabaji and bomb costs. I went through hell to get that map, I gave my left and percent for that map. That wasn't your captain. Well, I gave someone's left and percent for it. I did not sacrifice so much of my valuable time just for some big-chested broad with goo-goo eyes to swipe it. A collective sigh from several of his men made it to his ears, reminding him of exactly who was to blame for the theft. And you. He jabbed a finger at one of the guild men. Why aren't you looking with the rest of those horn dogs? Be back our cause, you. Shut up and go. With one almighty heave he grabbed hold of the mook and tossed him over the side of the 2-story building, a loud crack emanating from street level a moment later. Those remaining gave their glorious leader a wide berth while he fumed. I'm surrounded. He muttered, gurgling loudly when the hand he was trying to drag down his face couldn't move past his big red conch. How f***ing hard could it be to find a lone girl in a deserted town? I may not be a genius, but even I know that sounded stupid. The veins in the clown's forehead bulged out like worms were crawling just under his skin. Alright. Who's the dead man who said mother? The face of the guy attached to the body attached to the glowing finger inches away from his face smiled. Bye-bye big nose. Zing. It was only the cocky one-liner that saved Buggy's life. Unlike others, he knew he didn't give his opponents time to get in a last jab at him. Before acting, he managed to duck out of the way right before the space where his head had been was filled with hyper-concentrated light. Hey. His killer said indignantly. You weren't supposed to move. Shot to kill. Entirely out of an instinct to follow the captain's commands without question, the circus-themed pirates whipped out their flintlocks and unleashed a normally deadly hail of lead at the stranger. The light-based Logia user merely grinned like the idiot he would defend that he wasn't. The metal shots passed through him as though they were only passing through air, leaving only perfect holes which closed up in a glittery sparkle. Steak Nose knew almost immediately what was going on, his internship as a criminal being spent almost completely in the Grand Line. He had met more than a few of the nigh invincible Logia users. A breed of superhuman he had hoped to all but avoid in the sea. Don't let up. Turn him into Gorgonzola. Swiss. Whatever. They were clever, at least in their shooting strategy. Employing a continuous fire strategy where one would shoot while the other loaded the poorly conceived weapon. Never once did it filter through to the walnuts on sticks they call grey matter that if bullets were going to work on him, then he would have been dead already. The person can only be shot at for so long before they decide enough is enough. Of course, early is this brought on because of boredom, but nonetheless. Glimmer wave. The blade of light lashed out from a flicking forefinger, going from the size of a shaving razor to being as wide as the roof in seconds. It sliced through almost every gun pointed at the military prodigy. The pirates did not even realize the effect until wood, metal and fingers from whatever they had been connected to at the time. It was the most horrible sound you could imagine. How many of us can honestly say they've seen a man, let alone a fully grown bloodthirsty killer, break down crying like newborn babies? Clutching their severed digits and crying out, some for doctors and others for their mothers. The screams fell on Luffy's deaf ears. Ignoring the murderer's pleas for help, he scanned them. Looking for the one who led these men to this fate. Only to find he'd buggered off. That's when he heard a heavy clatter on the cobbles on the street below. He vanished in a flash of light. Reappearing at street level and called out after the retreating pirate Buggy. The crooked ringmaster stopped mid-stride. Frozen like a statue in fear. Luffy was on him in an instant, his hand glowing with deadly power to finish his enemy off in one attack. FL. Wait. Luffy paused, he peered down at his hand glowing brighter than the sun, then back up to the sweating statue. What? He asked, genuinely confused. Isn't it customary for you to try and bring me in first? He said with an uncharacteristically unshaken voice. I don't follow. Oh Neptune, I'm glad I already went. You can't just kill me as soon as you find me. You have to try and arrest me and take me to prison. Ooh. Oh yeah. I sometimes forget that part. He smacked the side of his head. He reached into his pockets and pulled out a pair of thick leather gloves, then into a sturdy pouch on his belt and pulled out some bluish-gray handcuffs. Buggy eyed them like a child in a candy shop. Wow. Genuine sea stone. Yup. Just put these on and you can't use whatever power I heard you have. He opened them up and held them out in front of Buggy expectantly. The clown looked at the cuffs for a second more before shrugging and raising his arms. Luffy lowered the cuffs on Buggy's wrists when he noticed something. Namely that his wrists were not there. Where'd your hands go? Buggy's cheerful smile turned sinister. You know, I found out something about sea stone that I don't think anyone else in the world knows. On its own it just negates devil fruit powers. The forearms shot out like missiles right into the cuffs. He hissed in pain for the split moment he and the sea stone manacles were in contact, and his segmented arms became life-threatening injuries. The impact, coupled with the power-negating stone in contact with him, sent the Vice Admiral stumbling. Mixed with a little gunpowder, and it makes a bomb that not even a Logia monster like you can survive. He cheered triumphantly, rapidly backpedaling while his remaining upper arms clenched. Back up on top of the inn, amongst all the crawling and crying men whose disembodied hands held the trigger cord of a small cannon, armed with a smiling cannonball. The clown screamed as he tumbled through the air in 5 different pieces, a shock wave from his explosive lifting him up into the air and into the side of a house. Fortunately, he hit the window and not the wall. Smash. Remember, he can't get cut. Crack. Ah. Stupid window frame. He crashed into the empty living room just as the smoke from the bomb rushed in through the broken glass, filling the room with ash and covering its creator. He lay on the floor for a minute after, whether it was to wait for the smoke to settle, or he was just nursing a bruised head wasn't all that important. Just as he shakily stood back up when he was sure it was safe, he flung himself flat against the wall of the living room and edged towards the broken window to peer out at his handiwork. Where the infamous Vice Admiral had once stood molten glass where stone cobbles had been pulverized into sand and melted in an instant spattered ground zero. Nearby houses much closer than this one were blasted off the foundations and crushed others like paper. Buggy begins to chuckle, pulling himself back outside on the stumps of his arms. He caught his foot on the frame and smashed into the road chin first, but did not stop laughing. His laugh grew louder and louder the nearer he got to the blast zone, becoming high and insane by the time he was right next to it. Ha 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 cough cough ha 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 cough cough ha ha. He laughed long and loudly, or short and loudly, with his lungs filling with ash with every deep breath he took. Ha ha, I did it. I killed a Logia user. Now who's coward Shanks? Who's a coward NOWWWW? Still you? Buggy had just enough time to turn before a shining fist smashed into his jaw at 186,000 miles a second, shattering the bones into a million pieces and causing it to tear away from his head, demolishing the building it plowed through far more destructive than his inventions ever had. Now he may be immune to the bone shattering and the violent removal of part of his face, but he still felt the blunt force like a speeding train slam into him. He fell to his back, grasping where his dimpled chin should be, his unseated tongue lolling about loosely while he rolled from side to side in agony. Luffy towered over him. Buggy's eyes as wide as he could with a rapid swelling of his face, and all at the sight of the boy not only alive but completely unfazed by his ultra-destructive sea stone buggy ball. Lee. He tried to say something, but without his jaw he couldn't communicate any better than a newborn babe. The teen officer gave the pirate the only smile he ever really gave anyone. Oh right, like I'm gonna tell you. He reached into the same pocket as before and pulled out a familiar set of shackles. He pointed a glowing digit between the clown's eyes. You might want to pull yourself together first. The blacked out pinholes he called peepers bugged out as best they could, and his mouthless face hole let out a sound that was supposed to be a nervous chuckle. Plunk. 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 Pick up the pace, you filth. Momonga kicked a pirate in the backside, pulling every man lined to him via chained collar forward violently. The clown pirates marched up the gangplank of the marine vessel in single file, each sporting some sort of disfiguring or comical injury. Sometimes both. Several blocks away, the tip of a chipped saber peeked out, making sure not to reflect a glimmer of sunlight. Well? Everyone. They got everyone. The holder of the sword bit into the remains of the scarf covering his mouth to curb his anger. Well, not everyone. Ear Hairman said in a somewhat upbeat tone. Idly scratching behind the ear of the massive lion sitting next to him, whining like a puppy, great clumps of its mane missing. What do we do now? Kabaji. The second mate looked at the first, considering his question for a second before simply walking past him. I don't know about you, but I intend to get off this rock as soon as the heat dies down. What? But what about the crew? The captain? The acrobat kept walking. If you want to get captured, that's your problem. He tossed his broken blade into a nearby gutter, pulling out a much smaller throwing knife. He started giving himself a swift haircut. But I think my talents would be suited to something more than entertaining the inmates. Logia the lion tamer watched his longtime crewmate walk further into the remaining dark back alleys of the city and away from any loyalty he had towards Buggy the clown. He followed seconds later, dragging the depressed lion with him like a child pulling a stuffed toy across the ground. A certain red-haired girl, with a stealth that matched a feline, had sneakily departed the town. Her boat was as far from port as she could land it. No one had really paid attention to the one girl walking away from town while they all rushed into it. She held her hand to her bosom every 10 seconds, subconsciously checking if the map was still there. She couldn't afford to lose it. It would take another 10 years to get as much as this one score would net her. She didn't know if her village could last that long. Buggy grumbled, stomping down the street as quickly as he could, trying to force his captor along with him. Anything to get out of the barrage of garbage and rocks being thrown at him by booing townspeople. Spitting violently when a particularly rotten apple splattered against his swollen cheeks, getting black gunk and mold in his mouth. "Can we pick this up?" He still snarled, peeing. Luffy mused. Gramps always said never pour salt in a wound. Well, Jay. Unless they think they're badasses. Then I should humiliate them as much as I can. Splat. Ugh. He yelled in frustration. Pulling at his restraints out of sheer anger, not a link strained against the clown's meager levels of inhuman strength. None of which meant anything compared to the strength of a monkey D. His men saluted while walking onto the ship with Buggy, with the exception of Zoro, who was, much to his other superior's aggravation, laying against a mast, mildly glaring at the younger teen at getting any action while he was stuck in the middle of the ocean. Momonga's glare wasn't nearly as intense as the swordsman's, but still clear on his face. "Monkey?" he said with a bitter taste in his mouth. Extending his hand. Luffy only smiled back, his tone of reply a tad too happy to be entirely honest. Dottie extended his hand to the Vice Admiral's, only to have it swept past and the older man taking the chains of his captive. Well. Buggy the clown. If this isn't a case of the minnow trying to be a shark, I don't know what is. Trying to scrape together some sort of reputation in the weakest ocean in the world, besides the shame of his crew, are we? The clown lunged for him and was knocked back to the floor by a leg to his skull that he hadn't even seen move. "We have a special place reserved for members of that crew in the down." He turned back to Luffy. "And as for you, Sengoku will be informed of the damages you caused to this town." He dragged the pirate captain below deck, muttering the whole way. Once the telltale click of the doors locking was heard, the men and villagers exploded into cheers. The people swarming Luffy pulled every which way for handshakes, back pats, hugs and more than one peck on the cheek from a pretty girl. By the time he managed to pull away and get up onto the ship, he was beet red and staring at the ground. As soon as he was up, so was the walk. Momonga had been quite clear to leave as soon as they got him. As the marine vessel pulled away, the villagers ran alongside it, the swordsman spotting one old man in particular who had no business running like that. A slip of paper that he'd been the mullet man handed him earlier. Luffy was also scanning the crowd, his brow knit. "Anything wrong, Luffy?" he asked. Drawing looks from the few not lapping up the admiration as they pulled away. "No, not really," he said. "I met someone earlier and I can't see them anywhere." "The girl?" Zoro said wryly. "Yeah. Oh, I see." He grinned, making Luffy's look deepen. "See what?" "Nothing." He grinned and walked off to find a comfy place to nap. "Nuo. Come on, tell me." The 3-year teenager chased after his subordinate to pry information out of him. At the same time, in a stretch of ocean no one had sailed into. On an island that many didn't believe existed, and in a field that any artist would sell their soul to capture on canvas, a lone figure smiled gently as he lay against the trunk of the picturesque place's lone eyesore. An ugly black twisted tree, it rose up to eclipse even the greatest of giants' height, and its almost bare branches spread out half a mile. The man hummed a tune he didn't care to remember the words to, peering up into the network of gnarled twigs and sparse dusk-red leaves. Wordlessly he got up. Stretching his legs a little, he jogged lightly till he reached near the end of the hanging branches, just as something dropped out of them. With a swift hand he grabbed for the plummeting object. Holding it up to the light and examining it. Green, with the shape and leafy scales of a pitaya, and covered in tight swirls. He admired the new devil fruit for a moment before walking back over to the trunk. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny whistle. A shrill noise barely on the apex of human hearing went out over the valley. At first nothing, then the sky darkened as a massive regular-sized seagull with a big shadow landed in front of him. He opened up the satchel the bird carried and put the fruit inside. "North Blue. Civilian," he said in a raspy Scottish voice. The bird nodded in a human fashion and took off. Flying faster than a bullet, it was out of sight and heading towards its destination in the blink of an eye. The man watched after the news until it vanished from view. He leaned back against a tree and eased himself down the trunk. Peering up into the branches where 100 other accursed fruit slowly ripened. I would end the chapter there. But I feel I should show you how Luffy really survived. Luffy looked in the direction that Buggy had buggered off in. Not exactly eager to chase after him. You see, he knew better than to underestimate someone who had ever sailed in the New World, even if they did leave and come to the east. He also knew that anyone who'd seen what he could do didn't bother to run unless they were A, capable of using, or B, hiding an ace up their sleeve. Not wanting to risk anything, he decided on another course of action. He brought his hands together and concentrated. The space in front of him shimmered, forming a vague outline in the air. Within moments the outline filled in with his features, his coloring, and in seconds an exact copy of the Vice Admiral was standing in front of him. Pika Pika. he whispered. Focusing his thoughts, he ordered the exact copy of himself to follow after the pirate while he watched out of sight, ready to pounce once Buggy's trap was sprung. Thanks for watching this video. If you really enjoy this video, like, subscribe and comment down below and turn on that bell notification. Don't forget to support and follow the Wolvenstrom for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. See you in the next video. Goodbye.